Silence scares toxic people more than anger ever could. Narcissists usually appear powerful. Loud voices, emotional games, cold manipulation, constant control. Most people expect danger from someone cruel. But the real shift begins when the empath finally stops tolerating the pain. Years of patience slowly turn into emotional exhaustion. Endless forgiveness turns into distance. Deep compassion turns into boundaries. And suddenly the person everyone saw as too kind becomes impossible to control. That transformation shocks people because empaths rarely break loudly. Their change happens quietly, internally, emotion by emotion. Tonight, you're going to discover why a fed-up empath becomes psychologically stronger than the narcissist ever expected. You'll learn the hidden mental shift that happens after repeated betrayal, why narcissists panic when empaths detach emotionally, and why the calmest person in the room often carries the most dangerous power. Many people misunderstand empathy as weakness, but beneath that kindness sits deep emotional intelligence, powerful observation skills, and an ability to read human behavior with terrifying accuracy. Once pain removes the empath's emotional blindness, toxic people suddenly lose their advantage. That is the part nobody talks about. That is the truth many narcissists fear most. Stay until the end because the final lesson explains why some empaths never return emotionally once their limit is crossed. Their silence becomes permanent, their absence becomes unforgettable. Welcome to Empath Energy, where we uncover the hidden psychology of human behavior, emotional strength, and silent transformation. Subscribe now and become part of a community that understands the power hidden inside empathy. Warning signs usually appear long before the damage becomes visible. Narcissists rarely chase emotionally unavailable people. They search for warmth, patience, compassion, someone willing to listen longer, forgive faster, and love deeper than most people ever could. That is why empaths become the perfect target. An empath naturally tries to understand pain, even toxic behavior. They notice sadness behind anger, insecurity behind arrogance, brokenness behind manipulation. While other people walk away from red flags, empaths often stay longer because they believe people can heal. Narcissists quickly recognize this emotional openness. To them, empathy is not beautiful, it is useful. Every conversation becomes emotional fuel. Every reaction becomes validation. Every act of forgiveness becomes permission to continue the cycle. Slowly, the relationship stops becoming equal. One person keeps giving, the other keeps taking. The narcissist feeds on attention, reassurance, emotional reactions, and control. Meanwhile, the empath sacrifices peace, energy, confidence, and emotional stability trying to save the connection. This imbalance becomes dangerous because empaths usually blame themselves first. They replay conversations in their minds. They wonder whether they were too sensitive, too emotional, too difficult. Meanwhile, the narcissist avoids accountability and shifts guilt back onto the empath. Over time, the empath becomes emotionally drained without fully understanding why. Their nervous system stays in constant tension. They begin walking carefully around certain moods, certain words, certain reactions, and the scariest part is this toxic cycle often hides behind moments of affection. Small apologies, temporary kindness, emotional breadcrumbs that keep the empath emotionally attached. Narcissists understand one powerful truth. Emotionally intelligent people can still be emotionally trapped when love becomes mixed with guilt, hope, and emotional exhaustion. Heavy emotional damage rarely arrives all at once. For empaths, it builds slowly in silence, one disappointment at a time, one betrayal at a time, one painful conversation at a time. Empaths often become experts at hiding their emotional wounds because they spend so much energy protecting other people's feelings. They excuse behavior that should never be tolerated. They tell themselves the other person is stressed, misunderstood, or emotionally wounded. They keep giving chances long after their own peace begins disappearing. Every ignored boundary leaves another emotional scar underneath the surface. But instead of reacting loudly, empaths usually become quieter, more tired, more emotionally withdrawn. The people around them often mistake this exhaustion for weakness, never realizing an internal war is happening inside them every single day. The empath begins carrying invisible emotional weight everywhere they go. Their mind stays restless, their heart stays alert. Even moments of silence start feeling emotionally heavy, and because empaths naturally absorb emotional energy deeply, toxic environments affect them harder than most people realize. A narcissist may forget a cruel comment within minutes, but the empath replays it for weeks, searching for meaning, trying to fix something that was never their responsibility to repair. Over time, emotional exhaustion changes the empath completely. Their patience becomes strained. Their trust becomes fragile. Their nervous system becomes overwhelmed from constantly surviving emotional instability. Yet they still continue trying to help, trying to understand, trying to save the relationship from collapsing. That is why the breaking point becomes so dangerous. By the time an empath finally reaches their limit, they are no longer reacting from temporary anger. They are reacting from years of suppressed emotional pain. Suddenly, the person who once tolerated everything begins seeing clearly. The manipulation patterns become obvious. The guilt loses its power. The emotional fog disappears. And once that emotional clarity arrives, the narcissist starts feeling something unfamiliar for the first time. Loss of control. Quiet warnings are often the final signs before an empath emotionally disappears. Unlike toxic people, empaths usually do not begin relationships with manipulation, revenge, or emotional games. They try to communicate peacefully. They explain their feelings carefully. They give honest chances for change. Even after being hurt repeatedly, they still hope understanding can repair the damage. That is why many narcissists completely underestimate them. They mistake patience for weakness and forgiveness for endless tolerance. But repeated disrespect slowly transforms something inside the empath. Every broken promise creates emotional distance. Every moment of invalidation weakens the emotional connection a little more. The empath begins realizing their kindness is being used instead of appreciated. At first, the changes are subtle. They stop over-explaining. They stop chasing conversations. Their energy becomes quieter, more guarded. The emotional warmth that once filled the relationship slowly fades away. Narcissists often panic during this stage because they can feel control slipping away, even before the empath says anything directly. Emotional reactions become smaller. Arguments become shorter. The empath starts observing instead of reacting. And that shift becomes terrifying for manipulative people because emotional detachment removes their influence. One day, the empath reaches a point where exhaustion becomes stronger than attachment. Something internally shuts down, not out of cruelty but survival. The constant emotional chaos no longer feels worth the damage. Suddenly, the empath who once begged to fix the relationship becomes calm and emotionally unreachable. No more desperate explanations, no more emotional pleading, just silence, boundaries, and emotional clarity. This is the moment narcissists struggle to understand the most. They expected another argument, another emotional reaction, another opportunity to regain control. Instead, they face the one thing they fear deeply, an empath who no longer cares enough to fight. And once that emotional switch turns off completely, the empath begins seeing the relationship with painful honesty. The manipulation patterns become impossible to ignore. The fake apologies lose meaning. The emotional dependency breaks apart. For the first time in a long time, the empath stops abandoning themselves just to keep someone else comfortable. Sudden emotional silence confuses narcissists more than rage ever could. Manipulative people survive through reactions. They expect emotional chaos because chaos gives them influence. Anger keeps the connection alive. Crying feeds their sense of importance. Begging reassures them they still hold power over someone's emotions. Every emotional reaction becomes proof that they still matter deeply in the other person's mind. That is why narcissists often provoke conflict intentionally. They create confusion, guilt, jealousy, or emotional instability just to maintain control over the emotional atmosphere. But everything changes when the empath finally becomes detached. The emotional energy disappears. The long explanations stop. The desperate attempts to fix things vanish. And for the first time, the narcissist can no longer predict the empath's behavior. That uncertainty creates panic. A detached empath becomes difficult to manipulate because they stop reacting impulsively. They begin seeing situations logically instead of emotionally. Guilt trips lose their effect. Love bombing feels artificial. Fake apologies sound empty. The narcissist suddenly realizes their usual psychological tools are no longer working. And that moment can feel terrifying for someone who depends on emotional control to maintain power in relationships. The empath's calmness becomes stronger than emotional arguments ever were. Their silence becomes louder than confrontation. Instead of chasing validation, they begin protecting their peace. That shift changes the entire dynamic. Narcissists often become more desperate during this stage. They may provoke harder, blame more aggressively, or suddenly act overly kind again just to pull the empath back into emotional engagement. But the empath has already changed internally. Years of emotional pain created a deeper awareness. They now recognize manipulation patterns that once confused them. They notice the cycle repeating itself, the charm, the guilt, the temporary affection, the emotional withdrawal. Everything becomes visible with painful clarity. And once an empath fully understands the pattern, emotional detachment stops being temporary. It becomes self-protection. The narcissist starts realizing something dangerous. The person they once controlled emotionally is no longer emotionally available to control at all. Clarity changes an empath in ways toxic people never expect. For a long time, the empath questioned themselves more than the person hurting them. They searched for explanations. They tried to see the good. They ignored their own intuition just to keep the relationship alive. But healing creates a powerful internal shift. The emotional fog begins lifting. Confusion turns into awareness. Suddenly, the empath starts connecting patterns that once felt invisible. They recognize how certain conversations always ended with guilt being redirected back onto them. They notice how apologies only appeared when control was slipping away. They finally understand that manipulation often hides behind charm, victimhood, and temporary affection. This emotional clarity becomes dangerous because narcissists depend on psychological access. They need emotional confusion to survive inside someone's mind. Gaslighting only works when a person doubts their own reality. Guilt only works when someone fears disappointing others more than losing themselves. Fake apologies only work when emotional hope is still alive. But a healed empath begins trusting their instincts again. Their emotional intelligence sharpens. They stop explaining their boundaries repeatedly. They stop defending their emotions to people committed to misunderstanding them. And once that happens, the narcissist loses the invisible control they once relied on. The empath no longer reacts to emotional bait. They observe quietly instead, calmly, almost coldly. Not because they became heartless, but because experience taught them the cost of emotional blindness. Toxic people become deeply uncomfortable around emotionally aware empaths because manipulation cannot survive under clear observation. Every inconsistency becomes obvious. Every mind game becomes predictable. Every attempt at emotional control loses strength. The empath who once felt emotionally trapped now becomes emotionally untouchable. That transformation often shocks the narcissist the most because they remember the old version, the forgiving version, the emotionally available version, the version willing to sacrifice peace just to preserve connection. But that version slowly disappeared the moment the empath realized something life-changing. Protecting your peace is not cruelty. Walking away from manipulation is not weakness. And emotional distance can sometimes become the healthiest form of self-respect. Nothing unsettles a toxic person more than an empath who no longer reacts emotionally. The same person who once over-explained their feelings now answers with silence. The same person who once chased peace at any cost now protects their energy without guilt. That calmness feels unfamiliar to people who relied on emotional access for control. Narcissists expect chaos. They expect emotional reactions they can manipulate, twist, or weaponize. But the fed-up empath becomes different. Their voice becomes steadier. Their emotions become controlled. Their attention becomes selective. They stop wasting energy trying to convince people to care. And this change often looks cold to those who benefited from the empath's self-sacrifice. But this is not cruelty. This is survival after emotional exhaustion. For years, the empath ignored their own pain just to keep relationships alive. They abandoned their intuition, their peace, their emotional boundaries. Now, for the first time, they begin choosing themselves. Toxic people struggle to understand this transformation because they mistake kindness for weakness. They believed the empath would always stay soft, available, forgiving, and emotionally reachable. But pain teaches powerful lessons. The empath learns that not everyone deserves unlimited access to their heart. They begin noticing how some people only return when they need attention, validation, or emotional comfort. Instead of reacting emotionally, the empath quietly observes behavior patterns, and observation gives them power. Their calmness becomes a shield. Their silence becomes a boundary. Their emotional control becomes impossible to manipulate. That is why toxic people often call healed empaths different or cold. In reality, the empath simply stopped abandoning themselves to keep others comfortable. They no longer shrink their emotions to avoid conflict. They no longer carry responsibility for everyone else's behavior. And once an empath reaches this level of emotional discipline, something remarkable happens. Their presence changes completely. They stop seeking approval, stop fearing rejection, stop begging for understanding. The emotional dependency disappears. In its place comes clarity, self-respect, and a quiet strength that toxic people cannot control anymore. Deep observation is one of the most underestimated strengths an empath possesses. While most people focus only on words, empaths notice energy, tone, hesitation, facial expressions, and emotional inconsistency. They sense tension hidden behind smiles. They hear disrespect hidden inside jokes. They notice when kindness suddenly feels performative instead of genuine. For a long time, many empaths ignore these instincts because they want to believe the best in people. They silence their intuition to preserve peace. But once awakened by repeated emotional pain, those same observations become impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the empath starts understanding the narcissist with painful accuracy. They recognize the patterns behind the charm, the emotional cycles, the strategic apologies, the moments when affection appears only after distance begins growing. Every manipulation tactic becomes visible because empaths naturally study emotional behavior on a deeper level than most people realize. That awareness becomes powerful psychological armor. The narcissist can no longer hide behind confusion or mixed signals because the empath now sees the intention behind the behavior, not just the behavior itself. And that changes everything. The empath stops reacting to words alone. They begin watching consistency, effort, energy, actions. Toxic people become uncomfortable around emotionally aware empaths because they feel emotionally exposed. The mask stops working. The performance loses effectiveness. The empath notices the subtle guilt trips, the hidden control tactics, the emotional tests designed to provoke reactions. But instead of confronting every manipulation emotionally, the healed empath often becomes quiet and strategic. They conserve their energy. They stop revealing every thought and emotion openly, not out of fear but wisdom. Experience taught them that some people study emotions only to exploit them later. That is why a healed empath can seem almost unreadable compared to their old self. Their emotional openness becomes more selective. Their trust becomes earned. Their compassion gains boundaries. And once an empath combines emotional intelligence with self-respect, toxic people begin losing the one advantage they depended on most: the ability to emotionally confuse them. A powerful shift begins the moment an empath stops confusing self-sacrifice with love. For years, many empaths carry the emotional weight of everyone around them. They become problem solvers, emotional caretakers, and silent healers for people who rarely offer the same energy in return. They believe compassion means staying patient no matter how painful things become. They keep rescuing people who refuse to change, keep fixing problems they never created, keep draining themselves emotionally just to prevent others from feeling uncomfortable. But eventually, exhaustion forces a painful realization. Constantly saving others while destroying yourself is not kindness, it is emotional self-abandonment. That is the moment the empath finally says, enough. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with clarity. Boundaries begin replacing guilt. The empath no longer feels responsible for managing everyone else's emotions. They stop apologizing for protecting their peace. Toxic people often react strongly to this change because boundaries remove easy access. Suddenly, the empath says no without long explanations. They stop answering every message immediately. They stop tolerating disrespect just to avoid conflict. And people who benefited from unlimited emotional access start calling the empath selfish, distant, or difficult. But the empath understands something now that they ignored for too long. Healthy love does not require emotional self-destruction. Real connection should not constantly leave someone emotionally exhausted. The healed empath becomes more selective with their energy, their time, and their trust. They pay closer attention to consistency instead of promises, effort instead of words, accountability instead of excuses. And perhaps the biggest transformation of all is this: they stop trying to heal people who are committed to hurting them. That emotional detachment feels threatening to narcissists because the empath no longer responds through guilt or emotional pressure. Their compassion still exists, but it now comes with limits, standards, and self-respect. The empath who once tolerated chaos in the name of love finally begins choosing peace instead. And once peace becomes more valuable than attachment, toxic control starts collapsing completely. Nothing frightens a narcissist more than becoming emotionally irrelevant to someone they once controlled. Narcissists depend on attention, reactions, and emotional access to feel powerful. As long as the empath keeps responding, explaining, defending, or chasing closure, the narcissist still feels connected to their emotions. Even negative attention can feel satisfying because it proves they still occupy space inside the empath's mind. But a fed-up empath eventually reaches a stage where emotional exhaustion becomes stronger than emotional attachment. They stop reacting to provocations. Stop chasing conversations that go nowhere. Stop trying to prove their worth to people committed to misunderstanding them. And that silence changes the entire dynamic. The narcissist suddenly feels something unfamiliar. Loss of influence. Messages become shorter. Emotional energy disappears. The empath no longer argues for understanding because they realize peace cannot exist where manipulation continues repeating itself. This emotional withdrawal often shocks toxic people because they believed the empath would always stay emotionally available no matter how much damage was caused. But silence becomes powerful when it comes from clarity instead of fear. The empath is no longer trying to win the narcissist's approval. They are trying to protect their own mental and emotional stability. That shift removes the emotional leverage narcissists rely on most. Without emotional reactions, manipulation loses strength. Without guilt, control weakens. Without access to the empath's emotional world, the narcissist begins feeling powerless. Many narcissists respond by trying harder to regain attention. Sudden kindness appears. Old memories get mentioned. Emotional pressure returns. Sometimes anger becomes more aggressive because emotional control is slipping away. But the empath sees through the cycle now. They recognize that temporary affection without lasting change is still manipulation. And perhaps the most painful realization for the narcissist is this: the empath no longer fears losing the relationship. Once an empath accepts peace over emotional chaos, their silence becomes permanent power. They stop trying to save connections that only survive through pain. They stop shrinking themselves to remain lovable. And when emotional dependency finally disappears, the narcissist realizes the control they once held is never coming back again. Pain changes an empath, but not always in the way people expect. Many assume emotional suffering destroys sensitive people completely. In reality, repeated emotional pain often sharpens an empath's awareness and transforms their entire understanding of relationships, The empath who once trusted too quickly begins slowing down, observing more carefully, listening to actions instead of promises. They become more selective about who receives their energy because experience taught them that not everyone values genuine kindness. This transformation is not bitterness, it is wisdom earned through emotional survival. The empath starts recognizing the difference between people who truly care and people who simply enjoy access to compassion. Their emotional intelligence deepens because they spent years studying human behavior through painful experience. They learn how manipulation hides behind charm, how inconsistency reveals hidden intentions, how emotional peace matters more than temporary attachment. Slowly, their entire presence changes. They stop forcing connections that feel one-sided. Stop trying to heal people committed to chaos. Stop ignoring red flags just because they see potential in someone. And perhaps the most powerful shift of all is this. Their kindness becomes intentional instead of automatic. In the past, the empath gave endlessly, often without asking whether the other person deserved that level of emotional access. Now, trust becomes earned, respect becomes required. Emotional safety becomes non-negotiable. Toxic people often dislike this new version of the empath because they can no longer take advantage of endless patience and unconditional forgiveness. The empath no longer confuses compassion with self-sacrifice. They understand that healthy love should not constantly demand suffering. That realization creates inner strength many people never expected from someone once seen as overly emotional or soft-hearted. The healed empath still cares deeply, but they no longer abandon themselves in the process. They become emotionally balanced instead of emotionally available to everyone. Their calmness grows stronger, their intuition grows sharper, their standards grow higher, and once an empath fully understands their own worth, manipulation stops feeling powerful. It starts feeling obvious, predictable, and emotionally exhausting to tolerate. This transformation looks dangerous to toxic people because the empath stops being emotionally accessible in the old way. The kindness is still there, the compassion still exists, but now it comes with awareness, discipline, and boundaries strong enough to block manipulation completely. That change can feel threatening to people who once relied on guilt, confusion, or emotional pressure to maintain control. The empath no longer reacts impulsively to criticism, no longer rushes to fix every misunderstanding, no longer feels responsible for saving relationships that continuously create pain. And for manipulative people, that emotional independence feels almost impossible to control. Many toxic individuals preferred the old version of the empath, the one who overgave, over-explained, and tolerated emotional chaos in silence. But emotional suffering taught the empath how to recognize patterns early. They now notice emotional games before becoming trapped inside them. They understand that repeated disrespect is not a misunderstanding, it is a choice. That awareness changes the entire energy of the relationship. The empath becomes calmer under pressure, more emotionally disciplined during conflict, less affected by attempts to provoke guilt or insecurity, and that quiet strength unsettles people who depended on emotional reactions to feel powerful. Toxic people fear emotionally grounded individuals because control becomes difficult when someone fully trusts their own instincts. The empath is no longer seeking permission to protect their peace. They stop needing constant validation from people incapable of offering genuine emotional safety. Instead of chasing connection at any cost, they begin choosing emotional balance over attachment. This is why healed empaths often appear distant to people who benefited from their emotional openness. But the truth is much deeper than distance. The empaths simply learned the value of emotional self-respect. They understand now that love without respect becomes emotional imprisonment, that constant forgiveness without accountability becomes self-destruction. And once an empath reaches this level of clarity, they become incredibly difficult to manipulate because they no longer fear walking away from anything that threatens their peace, dignity, or emotional stability. The most dangerous empath is not the loudest one in the room, not the angry one seeking revenge. It is the one who finally understands their own worth after years of emotional pain, the one who stops begging to be understood, Stops sacrificing peace just to keep toxic people comfortable. Stops chasing love that only survives through suffering. Because once empathy gains boundaries, everything changes. Kindness becomes wisdom, compassion becomes strength, and emotional intelligence becomes protection instead of self-destruction. That is the moment narcissists lose their power. Not when the empath fights harder, but when they stop needing validation from people incapable of giving genuine love. The healed empath no longer fears being alone. They fear losing themselves again. And that quiet transformation becomes impossible to manipulate. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak is realizing the person who cared the most finally became too exhausted to keep trying. No dramatic goodbye, no final argument, just emotional silence, distance, peace. And once an empath truly lets go emotionally, they rarely return the same way again. Their absence becomes permanent because their self-respect finally became stronger than their attachment. So protect your energy, protect your peace, and never feel guilty for walking away from what continuously destroys your spirit. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Empath Energy, and join a community that understands the hidden strength behind empathy. Because the strongest souls are not the ones who never break. They are the ones who rebuild themselves without losing their heart.